I want to look at photographs, which is not something I'm normally used to speaking about, but I'm very conscious of how valuable photographs have become, not just as a teaching aid, but also the way in which they can operate to prompt all sorts of different responses in people. And what I want to do today is just give you an overview of some of the photographs that are in the De Valera papers in the UCD archives and have been digitised here for the purposes of the virtual library. Just to take you through some of these photographs and how we might go about contextualising them. This is De Valera dressed in his robes as Chancellor of the NUI. I thought it would be appropriate to start with a university theme. De Valera was Chancellor of the NUI for an extraordinarily long time. He was actually Chancellor from 1921 in the midst of the War of Independence to 1975 when he, of course, died. And it was a job he took very seriously. De Valera obviously was somebody who, if he hadn't become a politician, may well have ended up as a mathematician. A professor of maths, perhaps. It was an abiding preoccupation and interest of his throughout his life. But I think it's significant that even in a year like 1935, when De Valera was extraordinarily busy with his political work and with his governmental work, that he didn't miss a single Senate meeting of the NUI. It was obviously something he took very seriously. But he was also interested in Trinity. He was interested in third-level institutions generally, and he did try and provide support for them at lean and hungry time in Ireland's history. And we get this sense of the kind of civic engagement of De Valera as a senior politician as well. The idea that they do have a role to contribute to education, the idea that they do have a contribution to make in that regard. This is 1960, the Golden Jubilee of De Valera and his wife Sinead. The wedding of De Valera and Sinead took place in 1910. They were married for nearly 65 years. And I've always been intrigued by Sinead De Valera because she is somebody who we tend to think of as a very small and old woman. We do tend to think of the images of the De Valera in the context of these images from the 1960s and the 1970s. But I'll tell you, she was a very formidable woman. She was someone who, in many respects, was probably more Republican than Eamon de Valera. She didn't have a public profile in the context of her political opinions or her political stances. But it does make me wonder, when you have a politician like that who has such a long political life, how important are the domestic conversations? How important is that private side? How important is family life? You can see the kind of family portraits there. The De Valeras had 6 children together. One son died very tragically in the 1930s. But many of those who were associated with the family inheritance, and many of those who you'll see in this picture, of course, went on to assume dominant roles in public life, whether that was through the Irish Press Company or whether it was through the Fianna Fáil party itself. And it does make you think, I suppose, about the kind of De Valera legacy in terms of the family name, a very distinctive name and a very powerful name in Irish society in many respects. This one is from 1961, the Boland Mills Garrison. And again, you can see the preoccupation that existed in the 1960s with trying to commemorate the 1916 Rising and indeed the foundation of this state, particularly on the part of a generation that were not going to be around for much longer. You know, you've got to start in the 1960s thinking about the survivors of the Irish Revolution. And again, this is a great challenge, of course, for anyone who's trying to come up with a caption. Who exactly are all of these individuals? How many of them are recognisable? How many of them had, status in the community? How many of them were well known? And how important was that particular episode in De Valera's life and in De Valera's career? De Valera was very preoccupied in the 1960s with how history would remember him, with what history's verdict would be on him as well. Because you've got to think of De Valera at this stage in the Áras. He has, since 1959, opted out of Dáil politics, and he has become president. He has an awful lot more time, I think, to reflect on the past. He's corresponding with his biographers in the 1960s, Lord Longford and O'Neill, and he is thinking about 1916 and so on. And it's also a reminder, I suppose, of the controversies associated with De Valera in 1916. Was he an effective commandant? Was he an effective leader? In terms of the role he played in 1916. There have been very contrasting verdicts on De Valera's performance during the 1916 Rising. And that those verdicts, I suppose, were influenced as well by contemporary politics and bitter divisions about the Civil War and so on. There had been a suggestion that De Valera, during the 1916 Rising, was hyperactive, that he was indecisive, that he was inexperienced, that he was making these decisions that were baffling some of his contemporaries in Boland's Mill in 1916. And again, the significance, of course, of Áras an Uachtaráin, of the gatherings at Áras an Uachtaráin, of the sense of Áras an Uachtaráin as being a place that was open for use in this kind of context, for commemoration and for gatherings that were relevant to the history of the state and the foundation of the state as well. This is De Valera and Harry Boland in New York. You'll see these are not in any particular order. This is quite a well-known photograph. And of course, it's associated with a fascinating era in De Valera's career, but again, a controversial one as well. De Valera's decision to spend 18 months in the United States during the War of Independence was a puzzling one for some. Many felt that he spent far too long there. Harry Boland found him an interesting travelling companion, shall we say. There was an idea that Harry Boland and Eamon de Valera were very unlikely travel companions and bedfellows, given their different characters and temperaments and outlooks and so on. But they did perform particular tasks in the United States. Because what de Valera is doing, of course, in the United States, and this is where the photographs become interesting. It's not just a question of, the open car tours and the glorious reception that is being accorded to De Valera, who was, of course, born in New York. It's also about De Valera negotiating the jungle of Irish-American politics during the War of Independence, which is a very difficult jungle to get through when you consider the organisations like Clan na Gael, Friends of Irish Freedom, the American Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic, all of these different groups. It was a very, very difficult a jungle to negotiate, and there were an awful lot of tensions around what exactly De Valera could and could not achieve during his American trip. It wasn't just about fundraising, it was also, of course, about trying to get international recognition for the Republic from the President of the United States, but to internationalise the Irish problem generally. And De Valera had mixed success in that regard, but there is a very controversial legacy, I think, from that trip in terms of the money and the funds that were raised and who had ownership of them and so on. So it was a very interesting episode for De Valera, and there are a lot more photographs of De Valera's American trip that could be used as well. This is a very powerful and symbolic image from 1938, and this, I think, goes to the heart of De Valera's foreign policy mission in the 1930s. This is De Valera accompanied by Frank Aiken, one of his senior ministers, Sean McEntee, another one of his ministers, Gerald Boland, another minister, and of course one of the founders of the Fianna Fáil party in 1926, and a very young Kevin Boland, who you might be able to spot there in the middle of the picture, who of course went on to become a controversial Fianna Fáil minister at a much later stage in the 1960s. And what was the significance of this particular photograph and this particular trip? Well, this is taken again, and included in this are 5 unidentified individuals who will be, I'm sure, identified as a result of this process of digitisation. They were arriving at Spike Island in Cove, County Cork. And this was in the aftermath of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1938, which gave the ports back to Ireland that had been maintained by Britain under the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. When I say it goes to the heart of De Valera's foreign policy, what I mean by that is that De Valera did genuinely believe that you couldn't exercise an independent foreign policy while that ports issue was unresolved. It did ultimately allow De Valera to declare neutrality in 1939, because these ports, from a strategic point of view for Britain, were very important and very significant in terms of naval defence and so on. So, that is regarded as having been a huge success, a foreign policy success for Eamon de Valera, and he very much wanted to control foreign policy in the 1930s, and this was the culmination of that very successful strategy around Anglo-Irish negotiations as well. But this photograph also makes me think of how these developments were being perceived in Britain. How was Chamberlain perceived? Was the giving back of the treaty ports, for example, regarded as a tactical mistake or a weakness on the part of Chamberlain? Certainly how someone like Winston Churchill would have presented it, for example. But arguably, Chamberlain had been quite tactical and clever himself in that by being quite generous about the ports, he managed to get De Valera off the chosen path and the chosen strategic path of kind of linking the ports and the issue of partition. So that was, I suppose, a bargaining tool of De Valera's that was taken away from him to a certain extent. So I think it demonstrates a very significant turning point in Anglo-Irish relations, and of course in the context of an independent and autonomous foreign policy as well. This is Frank Aiken de Valera and Major Vivian de Valera, son of Eamon de Valera, and Frank Aiken and Eamon de Valera and Mrs. Sally de Valera, who was his daughter-in-law. Frank Aiken and De Valera's relationship was a very, very interesting one and a very, very close one. And again, this is the kind of image that prompts questions about how close they were and how far back their connection goes as well. Frank Aiken assisted De Valera in his successful campaign in 1917 to win the East Clare by-election, which of course was the beginnings of De Valera's electoral success, one which lasted for a very long time. And they had a lifelong association. But I think De Valera had to be careful about how he used Frank Aiken as well. He was the most Anglophobic, I think it's fair to say, of De Valera's ministers in the 1930s. De Valera kept him away, for example, from the Anglo-Irish negotiations that led to the agreement in 1938 precisely for that particular reason. Aiken had quite a dictatorial style. He was initially Minister for Defence, but he held many other ministries. But he's also better known during this period, and this photograph dates from 1958, as, of course, Minister for Foreign Affairs. And he was Minister for 51 to 54, and then from 1957 to 1969, which again was a very, very long stint as a Minister for Foreign Affairs. It hasn't been surpassed since. And there was an awful lot of tension between Frank Aiken and Sean Lemass after he took over from Eamon de Valera in 1959. Because Lemass, I suppose, was trying to reorientate foreign policy away from Frank Aiken's beloved form of the United Nations back towards London and back towards Europe. And they didn't like each other at all, and there were a lot of tensions around that. And again, there was a lot of speculation as to whether Lemass would tolerate Aiken as minister because he was seen as De Valera's minister. And they did share a lot of views in terms of the issues of sovereignty as well. We also have this particular photograph, which I like. It's De Valera's 77th birthday, 1959, a crucial year when he leaves the leadership of Fianna Fáil and becomes President of Ireland. It's a staged photograph, but there's a lovely softness about it as well. And when I was compiling the book on De Valera, I got very frustrated that I couldn't find enough photographs of De Valera actually smiling. Because, De Valera does often come across and has a reputation as being very stern and technocratic and remote and austere. And it was nice to find a few photographs of De Valera actually looking quite relaxed and looking quite genial. And I think this is one of these. But it's also, of course, a reminder of how long De Valera had stayed. He was 77 at that stage, and he's embarking on his first term as president. Should he have gone in 1948 at the retirement age of 66? He didn't. He stayed on, and that was a staged photograph to mark that particular occasion. And I will finish with this one, which is De Valera and Dorothea McArdle. And again, this is in the 1950s, but Dorothea McArdle's book, The Irish Republic, had actually appeared at the end of the 1930s. And it was a very important book for De Valera because it painted De Valera and the Republican movement in a very flattering light. It was part, that book, I suppose, of what you might call the history wars of the late 1930s, where different versions of the history of the Free State and of republicanism to that point are being offered. But again, it prompts reflection on who was Dorothea McArdle, how much do we know about her, how important was she as a writer, should we just see her as being the author of the Irish Republic and of being De Valera's custodian, or the custodian of De Valera's version of history. There were times when there was a very fraught relationship between Dorothea McArdle and De Valera as a result of the Constitution, for example, and the provisions relating to women in the Constitution as well. So that'll just give you a flavour of the photographs and some of the challenges inherent in contextualising and captioning, but also identifying unidentified individuals. I think the value of the virtual library is that in putting these photographs into the public domain, it will encourage their use as a teaching tool, but I think ultimately will encourage a much fuller sense of what they are about and who is in them. Thanks.